Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk Podcast. This is another special edition of the podcast. This time it's an audio recording of a human risk webinar that I did with behavioural science and organisational change expert Koen Smets. Now, he supports organisations in implementing change and dealing with the behavioural aspects of it. So he's an ideal person with whom to discuss change under COVID. We're all being required to make changes to our lives. There's lots of things going on. How do we cope? And what dynamics are we seeing taking place? Now, as ever with Zoom webinars, the audio quality isn't as high as I would normally like. So my apologies for that. I'm looking into ways that we can improve that going forward. But as ever, I hope that lower quality audio is compensated for by high quality content. So please enjoy the recording of my webinar discussion with Koen Smets. Welcome to this Human Risk webinar. I am joined by my co-host Koen Smets. I will let him introduce himself in a second. Please feel free to ask questions. This session is being recorded and will be available afterwards as video and audio. My name is Christian Hunt. For those people who don't know, I am the founder of Human Risk, which is a behavioural science-led consultancy that focuses on the areas of risk, compliance, conduct, and ethics. And I'll hand over to my co-host to introduce himself.
Oh, hello. Thanks, Christian. Thanks for inviting me on this webinar. I'm Koen Smets. Some of you may know me on Twitter as Confucius, where I also describe myself as an accidental behavioral economist. I'm an engineer by training, but I've been doing organization development for more than 25 years. And that's really been my entry point into human behavior and indeed human risk as it appears in organizations as well. And I discovered that economics and indeed behavioral economics are two very valuable tools to diagnose and try and address organizational problems. So that's what I've been doing for the last 10, 15 years, applying those particular instruments in my work in organizations. And yeah, I came across Christian a few years ago. I think we've chatted many times. And of course, in this really interesting period, this is not my normal hairdo. This is my COVID haircut. I was planning to go to have a haircut the day before the lockdown was announced. So I've got, my hair is like 2 centimeters longer than it would have been at its longest. So. But anyway, so I think as the theme for this webinar suggests, it's a time of change, and this is my business, so it might be interesting to explore how aspects of corporate and organizational change can tell us more to help us understand how we cope with the change in a sort of a pandemic situation like we are in. What we can learn from that, but also how we can perhaps prepare better in the future. Not that anybody hopes, I think, we will ever experience anything like this again in our lifetime, but you never know, and there may be other disruptions that we don't expect, and for which there are things we can do to be less combobulated or discombobulated when they happen.
And why don't we start off just by exploring the challenge of change? Because I think, we can come on to explore this, but I think there's a dynamic of sort of, change may all be the same thing, and it may be that. But let's just explore generally what do you see as the sort of the behavioural challenges around change? How do we cope with change as human beings, or not cope, and what typically happens?
Well, it's a very big question, of course. But on the other hand, change is everywhere. And I think on the one hand, maybe I'll start with something that's often, sort of phrase that's often used in organizational change, that is resistance to change. So there is this sort of mythical thing that stops people from changing. I think it is mostly a myth. People are not inherently resistant to change. We change things all the time. We change, most of us, at least I think, change underwear every day. So we don't use the same underwear. We don't eat the same thing every day. Many of us go on holiday to different places. So it's not as if we want the same thing day in, day out. I think the the essence of change is that either the environment in which we do what we do changes, and that will have an influence. It may make things easier, that's great, or it make it more difficult, which is not so great. Or we are somehow expected to either do things differently or to do different things. And when you start talking about doing things, you're really talking about decision making. You're talking about choices. When we go to work, we have a certain degree of freedom to do what we do first in the morning, how we do this. There are certain things that we have no say in. We have particular procedures. You will know this, Christian, especially in the financial industry. There are lots of rules that you need to follow. If you're in advertising, I guess you'll be less tied down to particular things. But we work within certain degrees of freedom, and we tend to be quite content operating in that way, provided we have a sufficient degree of freedom. We're not just automata that follow instructions day in, day out. That's all great. Now, when there is change, then that will upset the dynamic that we are used to. It doesn't mean that we do the same thing every day, but there is a certain constancy in what we do normally. And then when there's change, and this could be the company is taken over, so new policies are put in place in terms of travel, in terms of bonuses, whatever, in terms of who you work with, where you work, those kind of things. It could be a new system that is implemented, and you've been using the same system for 15 years. It's all slipping in your fingers. Now you find you have to learn something new. There's a lot of work involved, so on. So these are things that may appear as resistance to change when people start saying, "Whoa, hold on, a cotton picking minutes, I'm so sure about this and all that." But the thing is, this is not resistance to change. It's people challenging what is changing for them. And what I've always found useful is to try and separate a change, and sometimes the two happen at the same time, but in different ways and complementing each other. You have imposed change. That is, for instance, the company's taken over. Well, you have no choice. That is just happening to you. You just have to live with it. Or it could be we need to improve our customer service. So we need to start interacting differently with our customers. And there is nothing imposed. It's more like a sort of vague aim. And somehow all of us will need to interact with customers better. And I think there's quite a significant difference in how we respond to change like this. If the change is imposed, then clearly we will focus more on the downsides. What is going to change for me? What am I going to lose here? Maybe some people will gain, but I will certainly focus on what am I going to lose. And so what I need to know then is I need to know why things are going to change, because it will help me rationalize the change. And we will also need to be given some instructions on how to change. So if I have to use a new system, how is it going to happen? When is it going to take place? Will there be a changeover? Will I get training? Will other people be able to help me? Those kind of things. So I need to be given some confidence that I can successfully adapt to this change. When the change is desired, as in, for instance, we need to be more efficient in developing new products, or we need to collaborate more efficiently across different departments. Nothing's imposed there. It's more a case like, well, we need to discover how we can apply this. And so it's a very different context. It's a change in which you have much more of a say, and people will generally tend to be more receptive for that kind of change, especially if they also have the opportunity to, for instance, change things in their environment that they have been a thorn in their side for quite some time. So there's an opportunity to improve things. So I think that's kind of in a nutshell how I see, and I've seen over this career of 20 plus years, organizational change impact on people in organizations.
And I think there's a number of interesting dynamics in what you talked about. I mean, the first one that occurs to me is that focus on the negative. So there are plenty of examples historically where people have genuinely been granted more freedoms, things that sort of in the scheme of things are positive, mm-hmm. and yet they don't know how to react to them.
And so we see this sort of, the idea of learned helplessness. So I get so used to being trapped in a particular thing that even if freedoms are granted to me, it feels strange, and I cleave back to a world which logically I shouldn't want to leave to. So I think it's almost what you've described is it's not a logical response. Because the logical response ought to be, I will just cool, calmly and calculatedly work out what's good, what's bad, what do I need to worry about? And instead, what we do is focus on the downside.
I think that's right. And I think, I think focusing on the downside, I think it's part of who we are. We are a negative species. We are more concerned. I mean, this is loss aversion in a wider context, really. We are more concerned about the things that could harm us and stop us and prevent us from surviving and prospering. So, because it's all very well to look at opportunities, but we need to, first of all, protect ourselves. And I think this element of protection is actually an important one to bear in mind when you should change. What happens is when we are in a steady state, status quo kind of situation, we begin to internalize a lot of the trade-offs we make, what we're going to do first, what's more important. It's more important to listen to this guy than to listen to that guy. In my work, this is a colleague that's helpful. This is one that's not so helpful. We internalize these into heuristics and rules, in a sense. And so we no longer treat them as, right, I'm going to deliberately think about reason what's the best thing to do. We just follow those rules. Now, when there's a change, it often violates some of those rules. And they could be really personal principles like, what? They asked me to do this. Or they could be existing corporate values or corporate habits. Or they could be just routines that you're used to and feel comfortable, in the same way that an old pair of shoes feels very comfortable, and suddenly you're given really brand new trainers, but they don't fit as well as the old ones, and so you feel uncomfortable. So there is this sort of, I wouldn't say it's not logical. I think it's not even irrational. I mean, irrational is a term I really don't like, because we don't. I mean, it's so hard to define. But it's irrational. It is not being reasoned. We don't reason necessarily about change. Now, there is an opportunity there, of course, for managers and leaders to engage with the members of an organization on a reasoned level. But too often, what you often see is that in organizations, the people at the top, they spend 6 months or a year palavering about the change and getting consultants in and coming up with different scenarios, and they are, it's all over them. And when it's all ready, they say, now we're going to launch this. They kind of implicitly assume that everybody has gone through the same process as they have. Most of the people in the organization, this is brand new, so they get a cold shower, and of course they're not going to say, hey, cold water, fantastic, yeah, more. It's not happening. So I think from a leadership perspective, to get change to start at the right level, as it were, to have a good foundation for a successful implementation, you need to understand who your audiences are. And very often in a large organization, change will manifest itself differently to different people. So you really need to think about what is going to change to each of these different constituencies, and pay, like they will do, pay more attention to the negative aspects of the change, to the losses that people experience, and engage with them at that level, and try and have this sort of logical discussion about what those losses and gains are. Is it true? Because there's a lot of misperception often. Communication, as we've seen last Sunday, is not always as clear as it could or should be. And so the person communicating may be totally convinced that the message was 100% clear and, totally unambiguous, no problem at all with it. And people are looking at each other and say, what the hell was this? I have no idea what stay alert. What does that mean? How can I stay alert? Stay at home is easy. Just stay at home. But staying alert, and wash your hands and stay alert. Okay, I'm really alert now. I'm washing my hands. Look how alert I am. We laugh and we smile, but the equivalent happens in organizations as well with change communication, where it goes over people's heads. It has no significance to what the change will mean in their particular environment. And of course, not everybody will stand up and say, you're talking bollocks. They may just say, okay, well, if nobody else stands up, yeah, we'll just try and do it. And then you get into quite risky territory, of course, because people will not understand why they need to change. They will not understand what they need to do. And so they will be on a spectrum somewhere from, I'm not doing anything until it's really, really clear, I'm holding on to whatever I have, all the way to, well, they don't seem to know what they want, so I'm just going to improvise. And somewhere in the middle, there might be a handful of people who have got it and sort of try and do the best they can within. But that's not a good way of implementing change. So you really need to, when you plan a program of change, you really need to think about who's going to need to change, how, and do they know why? Do they understand what they need to do, how they'll need to do it, what the implications are, how they will feel about it, and so on. That, I think, if you don't do that, then you really are setting up trouble for the future.
And I think that there's several dynamics that I find, really resonated with me in terms of some of the other things I've seen. One is this idea that when organizations, and you could say the same about governments, impose things on a target audience, they've been planning them often for ages. And so things that seem logical to you when you've been in the depths of it don't necessarily seem logical to the target audience because this is fresh to them. And so they might not even understand where you're coming from in the first place, but they sure as hell won't have had the time to adjust to this particular piece that you've had. And even if you've had a day to think about it and they've had 5 seconds, there's a clear mismatch between those two pieces. So we shouldn't be surprised. And yet what we see very often is that approach of what's organizationally convenient, what makes sense for, let's message what the organization wants. And it doesn't reflect on the target audience. And I saw a great thing this morning, which I'll tweet this afternoon, which was designed for charities, but actually I think applies to anything. And it was it was a nice Venn diagram that sort of said on the left-hand side, one of the circles was what the charity wants to tell people. And on the right-hand side is what people want to hear from the charity. And then there's the overlap. And it was a very slim pickings in the middle. And so you looked at those things and thought both of those things make sense. And I think any sort of change, if you don't think about the target audience's perspective, it's never going to land with people. And what's important to you organizationally might be the last thing they care about.
Well, absolutely. And I think, this is true for communication in general, of course. When you communicate, communication is most of all about listening. It's about understanding what people have understood, and not about, well, I've given them the message, so my job is finished here. You need at least one feedback to understand whether they actually got the message or not. I think maybe one more thing also in terms of preparing for change. Some of you may be familiar with the so-called IKEA effect, depending on whether you're sort of northern or southern, which really refers to how people feel about something if they have a personal stake in it, if they have been involved in making it. It refers to the fact that we all feel really proud and kind of almost not possessive, but really sort of, this is my Billy bookcase that I built here, and I'm really, this is the best bookcase there is. So we feel protected of it. And I think if you involve people in actually developing the change and bringing in their own perspective and say, well, if you want to do it that way, maybe here's another way you could do it. All right, okay. And then at that point, they will be, first of all, they will find it easier to accept the change because they've been part of the process and they have contributed to it, but they will also feel part of it. It will not be management is imposing this change. It will be more of a collective effort that, well, I worked on this, so I'm for it. Yes, okay, I'm going to lose some stuff, I'm going to win some stuff. So you sidestep a lot of the potential issues if you involve people early on. And of course, in a large organization, you can't involve everyone. But then you can pick people with influence, people that have the trust of their peers, their colleagues, their teams. If they take part in the change and they go back and say, I've been working on this and this is kind of coming out, and I think it's a good thing for these and these reasons, you do away with 90% of all the potential mess that you otherwise would run into, and you can your change will be much more successful.
And I think there's an interesting political piece here as well. If you look at the people you might want to think about silencing, not necessarily in a sort of Stalinist way, are going to be the people that are naturally opposed to it. So rather than have them sitting, it's the classic having them inside the tent pissing out rather than outside the tent pissing in.
Well, that's very true. And I think that when I work with clients on change, I like to speak with as many people as I can before the whole thing really gets going. And I'm looking at the frustrated people that are still there. Obviously, people that have been so frustrated they couldn't cope, they've left. But there are people still there, and they are there and they are entertaining the hope that one day things might change for the better, and this could be the opportunity. So you try to get these people in, you let them vent a bit so that you get the sense of what it really is that they think is not good, and then you try to see if this can be combined. And the thing is, they have energy, and the energy is all channeled in a negative way so far. But that energy, if you just sort of change gear in reverse and then change the steering wheel a little bit, then it could help as a source of energy for this change here. So absolutely, I think this is again something that's often not recognized, because people tend to surround themselves with yes men, people who are always say, yeah, this is great, this is fantastic. I think it's the people who are not happy with something and have a good case. Those are the people that I think if you bring them into a change, that can at least make a big difference in success of the whole thing at the end.
And look, in the spirit of encouraging people to ask questions using the chat piece, we've had a question from Ruth saying, the original question was, what role do you think fear plays in resistance to change? And she's corrected that. I meant role, not rule. Beginner's mind. Beginners always welcome, Ruth. So what role do you think fear plays in resistance to change?
Well, fear is a sort of expression of loss. It's the expectation of a loss that hasn't happened yet, but it's a way in which we process the prospect of a loss. And I think if fear was not useful, we would have lost the ability to feel fear. So it is useful and it is adaptive in many cases. But the problem is, of course, is the fear justified? Is it rational? That's, of course, a question we can't answer in general, but it's a question that you can explore by engaging with the people in the organization to get a sense of what people fear. And I mean, it's one of the exercises when I do organization change programs. One of the first exercises I do with people in workshops is hopes and fears. Get people to put their hopes and fears of a change on the table. And clearly you want to give a bit more attention to the hopes to at least get a sense of positive things going, but you don't want to dismiss or sort of paper over the fears. You want people to express what they really fear. And in many cases, these fears are totally ungrounded. But because of poor communication or no communication, rumors have taken over. I mean, this is one of the things that changes. Well, if you don't communicate, it will happen anyway, but it won't be what you want. You will start making up things. And so you want to understand what people's fears are, and you want to engage with them. And some may be justified, like, okay, we're being taken over by this big foreign company and there will be some job losses. Right, okay, let's not pretend they won't happen. But then let's see at how can we help the people who will have to go? How can we make sure that the people who stay don't feel that their department is being emasculated and is supported with what it needs to do and so on? So we can start talking about it and turn the fear into an element of acceptance, and then a positive way of, okay, how can we now deal with the negative aspects of this change so that we come out of it better? So I think fear, definitely a very important factor, and often sidestepped because in a way the leaders are fearful of having to engage about fear as well. So they'd rather that it's not there and push ahead anyway.
And I think there's something interesting about fear of things you've been through before versus things you haven't. So I know, public speaking is for some people find terrifying. The reason they know it's terrifying is because they've been through an experience before. It didn't go particularly well, or they've seen other people get it wrong and stage fright. And that's a logical thing. Whereas what we're going through at the moment, he said, neatly pivoting into the current situation, is something that for the majority of people is an unknown. And so even if you've been through a pandemic before, there are dynamics of this one that are potentially different, particularly if you're in a country that hasn't recently experienced something like this. There's a different sort of fear coming out of the unknown, as opposed to, there's a little bit of legitimacy around the fear because I've seen something like that before.
Yeah, and I think the fear of the unknown or the fear of uncertainty, I mean, we are not generally very good at handling uncertainty. So we'd rather be reassured by people talking nonsense than being told by experts that really it could be this, could be that, or something else we don't know at the moment. And of course, the media play to that because the media like to headline really concise, simplistic messages, and then, if need be, completely do a 180-degree turn in 2 days' time and pretend the day before yesterday never happened. So yes, I think the fears here are genuine, and I think one of the challenges I think we see here with the COVID-19 pandemic is we are actually quite good at evaluating positive and negative effects of what we do. I mean, that's again a very adaptive trait we have. If we in an organization, if we insult the boss and we see the reaction, then it's the kind of thing that it's an experience we generally don't want to repeat, and so we'll be more careful in the future. So we learn from feedback. If we do something and it's good for us, we'll do more of it. If we do something and it's not good for us, we'll try and avoid doing this kind of thing. In this particular case, we are being told stay at home is very important because we protect the NHS, save lives. But even recognizing the magnitude of the tragedy that is unfolding in this country and around the world, with a number of people dying of COVID-19, for the vast majority of us, we have no people in our circle of family and acquaintances that are ill, or even less so, have died of COVID-19. So we've been doing stuff for 6, 7, 8 weeks now, and it makes no difference whatsoever. Or at least there's no visible difference. Yeah, we are told, yeah, we're really doing very well, fantastic. People of the Britain, blah, 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 and look, the NHS is coping, fantastic, great, well done. But it's hollow words. We don't really notice the difference of behaving the way we should. And because it's so costly to do this, not to see family and friends, not to go out, not to go to work, we, after a while, what was a sort of initially a kind of a rule, a heuristic, stay at home everywhere. Everybody was just repeating those three phrases, stay at home, protect the NHS, save lives. At some point, we begin to wonder, what's the point really? Am I making any difference? And this is, again, sort of a really human motivation. We want to make a difference. If we are doing something that doesn't make any difference, especially if it's costly, then we begin to wonder why we're doing it. And that, I think, is one of the challenges of the changes in our behavior that are required to get on top of this pandemic. Our individual behavior matters not. I mean, if I go to the seaside or to the Lake District or whatever, just me, it's not going to make a blind bit of difference to anything whatsoever. And the same applies to my neighbor and to you and to anybody in this webinar here. If one of us goes and does these things, it makes no difference. Trouble is if it's lots of people doing it. But we don't have a conception of this. I mean, even the whole idea of exponential growth, we just can't get our head around that. And so the challenge for the people trying to govern us, I think, at the moment, is to get us to do the things that are necessary to contain and combat and ultimately conquer this virus, while bearing in mind the pressures we feel. It's not, I mean, partially it's fear, but it's not so much fear of catching the disease, because the longer it lasts, I've been going 8 weeks. I've got a sign of COVID-19, so maybe I've had it, maybe. So I know, I mean, I'm not speaking personally here, but I'm sure other people feel the same. 8 weeks ago, I was kind of concerned. I used to suffer from asthma as a child, so I'm in the some kind of risk category. So you worry about this kind of thing. But after 8 weeks, if you haven't really noticed anything, then you start wondering, how bad can it really be? And it's totally human that you start wondering whether the price I pay every day in not seeing my children, my grandchildren, is really paying off in any way. It's not paying off to me. And lots of people think that way. And in the same way that we need to be aware that just one person going off to the Lake District is fine, if 100,000 people decamp to the Lake District, that's not fine. So if we need to kind of develop a sort of collective conscience about how we need to deal with this pandemic. And I think that's a role that I think our leaders, the government, need to try and help us with. I'm not sure they're doing a particularly good job, but I think that's important for us to get a kind of stake, I'm going on here, but just one more point about the face masks. which has been a controversial topic since the beginning of this pandemic. Should we, should we not? And then there's been sort of insults thrown from one side to the other, which are not very helpful. But I think the consensus in most cases, face masks are for protecting others rather than for protecting us. They stop us radiating virus material if we are infected and are asymptomatic. They're not really going to help us not catching the disease, because I've seen people wearing gloves in supermarkets and then touching their face not wearing a mask, touching their face with the gloves. Oh, well, what's the point? So we're not very good at that. But at least if you have a face mask, it'll stop viral material getting out. So the real reason why we ought to wear face mask is out of altruism. It's slightly annoying, but it will protect somebody else. And it will protect not that other person, but it will protect a few thousand people down the line, that if we don't infect this person, they will not infect somebody else, and so on and so on. And that, I think, is something. It's a consequence of change or no change that is much bigger than what we are used to in terms of organizational change or personal change. And I think it's hard to get our heads around that, and to continue using that as a driver for the choices we make. Are we going out? Are we wearing a mask? Are we sticking to the social distancing rule and so on?
But there's a really interesting point off the back of what you've just said, which is around this. And this, I think this is uniquely a UK thing, but you can sort of see organizations adopting a similar approach in other situations of sort of, people should use their common sense. And what was very interesting in what you were articulating there is that your common sense answer for you isn't necessarily the pro-social societal common sense answer. And so this idea that we will automatically conclude what the right thing from a societal perspective is probably flawed. And we know this, for example, if we're in a hurry, we're speeding down the motorway, maybe we're going over not you or I, obviously, or anyone on this call, but other people would go over the limit and they drive recklessly to get to the airport on time. And of course, you do that, and it's this thing called the fundamental attribution error. You do it, and it's perfectly okay because you know why. See someone else doing it, and they are, insert expletive here, they're the worst person in the world, terrible, irresponsible idiots. And because we don't know why they're doing it. And they may be applying exactly the same, if not more compelling logic than we would apply. So I think there's something interesting here when we reflect on change, which is if the scale of the challenge and the things that are going on don't have individual visibility or resonance, then this idea that we can just autonomously expect people to get to the right answer doesn't necessarily kick in at all. In fact, you're more likely to have people doing things you don't want them to do if they deploy common sense in a manner that works for common sense for them, and you don't explain the bigger picture.
Mm-hmm. Yep, I think that's absolutely right.
And look, so if we look at COVID as a challenge, which is clearly the title of why we're here. I mean, you've alluded to the fact that on the one hand, change is, there are dynamics that apply to it of whatever sort. We have basic human desires, needs, concerns that play in whatever the change is happening, whether positive or negative. And yet, and I don't want to use the word unprecedented because we've heard that an unprecedented number of times, but it's, so there's some dynamics here where I would say normal change dynamics apply. Do you think there are some unusual change dynamics that apply to this, or is this just an extreme manifestation of what we would see under normal sort of badge of change?
Well, I think there are two things that are at least extreme. Maybe they're not totally unusual, as in a different realm. I think one of them is that it is profound. I think again, I need to sort of step back a little bit. If I look at my own life, I work from home 80% of the time. So for me, any particular day is not all that different from what it was back in January. But for many people, it is very different indeed. Their children don't go to school and all that. So on a personal level, there's a lot of change. Then for many people, there are financial strains playing out, and so all these things. None of them is extreme in itself, but I think the combination is extreme, and it is imposed. And then the second thing is what we've just been discussing, that is that the impact on us is not all that material, but is the aggregation of the impact on different people and of the effect of behavior. If it's one person behaving in a certain way, then nobody would notice. If it's half the population of London behaving in a particular way, then it's a very different affair. And I think these make the change, at least qualitatively, different. I think, in the sense that, I mean, I started off by saying, well, we don't resist change. We are creatures of habit, so we like things to be pretty much the same as yesterday, the day before. Just imagine what life would be like if you woke up and your house had changed completely every day. It was totally different. We'd go doolally within 3 days, I think. It would just be impossible. So we need some kind of constancy. And a lot of the stuff that makes life enjoyable, I think, has been curtailed for the last 6-7 weeks. So that is what is leading to this again, a term that was ridiculed, but is now beginning to, people are beginning to see quarantine or pandemic fatigue, behavioral fatigue is setting in. We are being worn out by not being able to socialize, to go and have a pint, to go to the cinema, to go out and for a walk in the park, to go play tennis, play rugby, whatever we do. And I think in itself, again, at a personal level, it is not unusual. There are people who break their leg, who are rugby players, and they can't play rugby for 3 months. Fine, okay. It's not the end of the world for them. It's obviously not the end of the world for anybody else. But I think if nobody can go out and play rugby and or do anything else, then at some point you get this sort of the aggregation of what happens to us individually begins to gain some kind of essence in its own right and weighs collectively on our shoulders. And I think that makes it hard. And going back to some point you made earlier, Christian, about the response to change not being reasoned or deliberate, I think the trouble is that these things begin to poke into our, for want of a better word, our system one, our intuitive, our impulsive system. We are getting fed up. It's got to change. I can't cope with this anymore. And I think this is a challenge for us individually, I think, is to try and maintain a balance and say, we need to recognize the emotional strain that we sense as a result of being deprived of a lot of our liberties, but at the same time also try and rise above that with system two and being able to reason about these things and understand, okay, well, at the moment, the number of cases is not dropping as fast as we'd like, so we can't just open the floodgates and start behaving exactly the way we want. I mean, I saw a message coming up on my phone earlier about tube system. 70% of the underground will run next week at a capacity of 13 to 15%. Now, clearly, there's no way that London can function with a public transport that's running at 13% of capacity. So we just need to think this through and think about, okay, what's this going to mean? How can we make sense of it all? Not just making sense as in, oh, no, I understand, but also what choices can we and should we make as a result of the situation we're in and the prospects and so on. So I think, just to summarize, I think we need to recognize that our emotions are being poked by what's happening, and we need to resist reacting impulsively and emotionally to what's happening and sort of take a deep breath and think again. And I think we can probably find inspiration from others because we don't always and all respond in the same way. So if we look at how other people cope with this, use our network, obviously maintaining social distance as appropriate, but social media can help a great deal. And just sharing with each other how we cope, I think that can help. Now, whether it can help for many months to come, I don't know. But I think for the time being, this is where I think we can probably derive some strength from.
And we've had another question from Ruth, which thank you, Ruth. Anybody else, please feel free to send them. Is sort of saying, well, how, if you look at the challenges here of getting people back to work, and this is a governmental problem, but it's also an employer problem. I mean, many of the people on this call will be lucky enough to be in roles where they can work from home and that doesn't impact their own. But there are lots of people out there, lots of businesses where people need to be physically there. And so you've got this interesting piece of saying we need everybody. And there is clearly a conflict between the personal health desires and the message that people have been told before, which is stay at home to be safe. And this new thing that's sort of being pseudo-imposed with a sort of regulatory approach that says, we want everybody to get back to work normal, but obviously don't put yourself in debt. So there's a whole load of conflicting, arguably a conflict between personal interest and societal, in terms of the economy at least, and corporate interest. So how do people, how do we see that in terms of the challenges facing businesses? Because I think this is analogous to lots of other things where businesses need people to do things that might not be in that individual's interest at a particular time. Have you got any thoughts around how how can organizations navigate that?
Well, yes, and I think in a sense, as you say, whenever a change is taking place in an organization, or indeed when sort of normal operations take place, trade-offs always at some point pitch individual interests against the company interests. Now, mature companies will minimize those areas and will try to align the interests of all the stakeholders as much as possible. But it doesn't always work. And I think where the conflict is inevitable, I think there's one concept that is absolutely critical, and that is trust. And I think, imagine you work in an organization and the change program being announced and launched, and by some kind of historical process, most employees in the organization place a great deal of trust in the leadership. It's not easy it's not hard to see that change will be considerably easier to implement in that context, because when people trust the leadership, they will know that explicitly their concerns will have been taken into account. So if they feel there is some kind of sacrifice that needs to be made, they will do so, or they will at least receive it as being necessary, and in the wider scheme of things, the best possible. And it will be counterbalanced by some other benefit. And of course, not everybody will lose and gain the same way, but on the whole, it will be the better kind of thing.
So it's fair, basically.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, fairness is critical, but it goes beyond fairness. There is there's logic to this as well. It's balanced. It takes into account multiple things. It integrates things. So it's not, well, he's only listening to this or only listening to that. And I think if you have that level of trust, and that trust, I mean, it applies throughout the organization. Clearly, we want to see employees trusting CEO and executive team, but we also want them to trust their immediate supervisor. If you don't trust your supervisor to back you as one of his team, then you have already the makings of a dysfunctional organization. So that level of trust is critical in ordinary operation, knowing that, we're moving into psychological safety, for instance. It's another concept that's really very important for functional organization. It's important when you have organizational change. And now, if you are expected to go back to work, you want to trust your employer that they are doing whatever is necessary to safeguard your health when you go back to work. Now, that's one thing. Of course, you need to get to work, and that is something your employer often has little or no say over. Although I heard something, and I forget whether it was in UK or in Belgium, for instance, the construction workers, that they found some kind of way of having double the number of minibuses so that construction workers can travel to the construction site in safety. So I think, again, a trust, an employer that has the trust of their employees will come up with a solution and will involve people to come up with a solution. So it's like, with good friends that you trust, you will not enter into some kind of deep debate about, why are you doing this? And so you'll kind of assume mutually that you're doing the best for each other. And that's the way you go about it. Now, the thing is, of course, if you haven't got that trust right now, it's a bit late to start building it. It's the businesses that have historically operated with high levels of trust and high levels of psychological safety that will benefit from that. I mean, I wouldn't even call it investment. An investment is like sort of, well, I'm putting in some money, but I'm getting something out of it later. It's just the right thing to do. And if you do that kind of thing, then you will reap the benefits, even without having invested, because you do it because it's the right thing to do. If there is suspicion, then of course it'll be much more difficult. And you will, I mean, you already hear the unions standing up saying, well, we trust the employers to do this. And my heart bleeds when I hear this kind of thing, because it's not necessary. You could avoid this by having that kind of trusting relationship between the two.
Right. And I think there's something really interesting about a lot of noise being made around sort of doing the right thing. So you get people, for example, that say, you know, we as soon as the government told us to shut down, we shut down. And they'll be opening up as soon as so they're hiding behind the regulation piece as an excuse for, you know, it's almost outsourcing decision. Whereas I would say, I think a responsible business will say, actually, maybe we're not ready yet. Maybe, you know, the government wants us to start today, but we're just not ready. We haven't got the things in order. We're going to take another 2 weeks and then we're going to open up. Or actually, because we're super well prepared and we saw this coming and we've engaged with staff and told them we can open up on the day. And so I think there's something really interesting around people can smell this and you kind of know whether you trust your employer. And so you will react accordingly, which is sort of, you might, you know, if you're forced into work, you might have to go for financial reasons, but you'll do it begrudgingly. And you will remember this and you will behave in it. Whereas I think if the flip side is, you know, if they've demonstrated, but you're absolutely right, you cannot switch that on and sort of go, I know I may have been a bit of a shyster boss in the past, but trust me on this one. When you face it's the biggest issue people are facing, and that sense of sort of this is serious, and this isn't just about increasing profitability for the business so you get paid a bonus. This is like, am I going to die if I go to work today?
Yeah, and I think, I mean, it's usually the same kind of companies that will have spent the last 6, 7, 8 weeks preparing for this anyway. I mean, I was listening to Belgian radio earlier, it was last week, where Volvo Cars in Ghent, car assembly plants, had been preparing for 4 weeks. And so they started up with sort of a limited production capacity, and they now pretty much, and same with Audi in Brussels, they're almost at 100% capacity. So they managed to find ways of reorganizing the production schedule. They've extended the breaks, so people all have the opportunity to wash their hands, for instance. So simple things, and clearly they've involved the staff in coming up with those regulations, and it's fine. But that's because that was the way they worked before. They just they apply the principles that were applying before.
Right. So in other words, there isn't a special reaction.
No.
It is, you'd be doing the same thing, I don't know, if there was a natural disaster, right? And
yes.
and you had to shut down factory for a period of time to rebuild it, and you could only open half your production line.
I think that's probably a really good analogy. If there was a big fire or a flood or something, or a collapse of the building, then again, you'd say, okay, well, what can we do here? Obviously, we're not going to want people to work in a production hall where the roof could collapse any moment. We're not going to do that. But what can we do? We can move some of the machines in another sort of spare part of another hall or whatever. So you'll constructively work together to find a way, balancing the needs and the safety of people with the demands of the customers and so on. So it'll all be part of one integrated, balanced, sensible combination of influences.
And as we sort of look forward, I'm always conscious on these sorts of webinars. It's very easy to sit here and say, well, this is what you should have done ordinarily. And of course, that's correct. And there's a valuable learning point here. To recognizing that companies and individuals are at different stages. What are your thoughts on, you know, how can they start to get this right? Let's assume that they want to do the right thing. And I genuinely believe the majority of bosses and companies and organizations want to try on some level to try and do the right thing, to try and improve things. So wherever you are on the scale, from amazing employer to, you know, the sort of the worst Dickensian exploiter, but let's assume you want to take yourself and improve things. What sorts of things can people be thinking about now to kind of improve the way that the situation and kind of start to move in the direction that you've suggested? Well,
I think you may be familiar with the term the pre-mortem. So obviously there has been a mortem now. There's been, hopefully not a mortem for too many businesses, but at least there's been a big disruption where both the government and businesses needed to react in no time without much thought. So typically reactions tend to be extreme. And it's like sin in haste, repent at leisure. So there's now some time to think about, should we really have done that? Was it the right way? And so on. So we can draw lessons from that. But I think flipping that, we can think about the kind of disruption that a pandemic can cause, and there may be other external events that could cause big disruptions. And I'm thinking, for instance, of the eruption of that volcano that I couldn't pronounce. Actually, I managed to pronounce it once in 2010.
The Icelandic one.
Volcano, where obviously all air traffic stopped across Europe and much of the world. So stuff like that can be highly disruptive. And so anticipating what might happen to the business, to its supply chain, to its employees, to public transport and so on, thinking about that ahead of time so that you've done a little bit of the thinking and all you need to do is press the button. I'm often reminded of the late the Formula One driver, and my memory is failing me here. A Brazilian Formula One driver in Imola.
Nelson Piquet or no.
Anyway,
yes.
So
Ayrton Senna. Thank you so much.
Ayrton Senna. Yeah, that's the one. Who was found to have superhuman reaction times. So when something happened, he reacted more quickly than a nervous system is really capable of. But what happened actually is that he was running 20 scenarios in parallel in his mind. What if this happens? What if that happens? Then I need to do this, this, and this. So when something did happen, he was ready. He didn't need to start the thinking. A lot of the thinking had been done already. So he needed to just press the button. And he was like 2-3 tenths of a second ahead. And that's at speeds of 200 miles an hour is the difference between death and being alive. Now, obviously, at one point, it didn't serve him. Maybe he got a little bit too hubristic. But I think we can do the same thing in organizations and for ourselves personally. Like, obviously, making sure we are financially secure. Too many people don't have any savings at all. So what can we do to save more? Behavioral science can do a lot to help people make sure they have a little bit of a nest egg for situations like this. But also in terms of stock control, in terms of preparing people for working from home. Maybe one of the things that will come out of this is that more people will be working from home occasionally. So at least the infrastructure and the habit will be there. The way in which we organize meetings at work, so it doesn't need to be face-to-face all the time. There are certain things that we can change in the procedures things we have at work that will make it easier to engage that sort of mode of operation, the crisis mode, without sitting there like a rabbit in the headlights for 2 or 3 weeks before we really begin to realize what the hell could we be doing. We'll know. And I think, to me, that is where the solution lies. And we can tailor it, of course, by looking at where were the biggest pain points in the last 6, 7, 8 weeks in how we dealt with the crisis. What can we specifically learn from this that we could anticipate for?
And I fascinating. Agree with every word of that. I think the other bit that occurs to me is sort of one of the challenges is that organizations allow a sense of normality and stability. And of course, the world is uncertain and a bit messed up and weird, and stuff is going to happen. And so I think there's a lot of, things like quarterly reporting don't help. There's this need to sort of think very short term. Mm-hmm. There's a need to demonstrate you have everything under control. We see political leaders, the same thing. It's, trust, vote for me, and all these things will happen. And we all know that it's and to a greater or lesser extent, actually a lie or well-intentioned but undeliverable. And there's this sense of trying to control things. And actually, I think there's a lot of if one leveled a bit more and ran organizations not on the basis of we'll run the shortest possible supply chains, just-in-time delivery, we'll cut back on this, cut back on that, super slick, and we'll pretend it's all super manageable, was actually if we just said we recognize this is not a a sort of guaranteed piece of success. This is volatile, and we need to think in a way that's responsive, and that random things might happen and will happen. I think that's much better. But all too often we get leadership that is very certain, and people want to have a sense of direction. And there's a lovely interview I saw once with Darren Brown, the illusionist, where he was talking about, he sort of said, if you interview celebrities and you talk to them about what's the recipes of success, and whether it's business leader or sporting people or musicians, single-minded determination comes up pretty high on the list. And he said, that is, of course, a really good recipe for success. It's also a brilliant recipe for failure. Because if you keep doing the wrong thing, you keep doing the wrong thing. But we don't get to see those people because they don't get to write autobiographies or sit on chat shows. Yeah. So we have this misguided view of the world. And I actually think a bit of vulnerability and a bit of a recognition that, there isn't anyone that's sitting there that's omniscient. There isn't any strategy that's 100% resilient to every single thing. There's nobody that's nailed this. So we have to recognize the weaknesses in every single thing. And therefore we want challenge, and we want people to think creatively around it. And we don't want people to get too much stuck in a rut of saying this is the only way we can do things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you're right. And I think there's something interesting about you alluding to input from an illusionist to mentalist, not a business person, not an academic. And I couldn't not draw a musical metaphor into this discussion. Because
playing us out quite literally, almost. Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, what you said makes me sort of just in time, lean. It makes me think of a musical box. It's highly regimented. It's got the little pins at the right places, and it rotates at the right speed, and it's fantastic because it almost runs itself. You don't need to do anything at all. But if something happens that sort of jams the mechanism or something, it stops and nothing happens. So I think we could learn from jazz, because in jazz people know how to improvise. They don't know what's going to come. They probably don't even know what note they're going to play next, but they know it will be a good note. And so to loop back the element of trust, as a jazz musician, you need the trust of your fellow band members. You need to know that the drummer keeps the groove and the bass player and all that. And so the piano player keeps the harmonies going. They kind of stick roughly to the lead sheet. And then you just play your thing on your saxophone or whatever your instrument is. And that ability to improvise, I think, is probably uniquely human power. Because in the animal kingdom, again, animals tend to follow their instincts and do the same kind of thing. They respond in the same way to the same stimulus. We don't have to. So just imagine how much improvising power an organization has in the collective brains of its members. If we were able to harness that ready for the next disruption, whether it's a pandemic or something else, I think we'll be in a much better.
Beautiful. I've got scenes of you in a smoky jazz club somewhere, which of course is making me sad, because we all love to be in one of those at the moment.
Not for the moment, sadly.
Koen, listen, thank you so much. Thank you to everybody who joined. As I mentioned, this will be available as audio and probably video if I can make that piece work. Hugely appreciate you joining. Koen, remind us how people can follow you on social media, because you are highly worth following. There's blogs and Twitter, so just remind people where those are.
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter as Koenfucius. That's KoenFucius. It's a lame wordplay on famous Chinese philosopher, and my first name, of course. So I tweet a lot on Twitter, of course, so you can follow me there. And I write a weekly blog where I look at the world with my behavioral glasses on and try and make sense of it all. And you can find me on Medium again. So look for my name, Koen Smets, on Medium, and you will find my weekly blog post there.
Highly, highly recommended. Thank you for joining, and thank you to everybody that joined us, and thank you to everybody that's listened on the call. We can't finish this without saying, remember to wash your hands and stay safe. Thanks, everybody.
And stay alert. Stay alert.
Stay alert, indeed. Thank you.
Hi, it's Christian again. Thanks for listening to the recording. As I mentioned, if you're not already doing so, I highly recommend following Koen on Twitter, where you'll find fascinating and thought-provoking tweets on behavioural science-related topics, and his weekly blogs on Medium, links to those in the show notes, are always on my must-read list. Further webinars will be coming very soon. If you want advance notice of those, do subscribe to the Human Risk newsletter. You'll find links to that at human-risk.com. If you're not already subscribed to this podcast, then you'll find that wherever you get your podcast content. Thanks again for listening. Do stay tuned. Another episode coming on this channel very, very soon.